Hi there everybody, it's Steve from Elysian Forge. I had a little list of videos that I wanted to do. I think I've mostly made my way through that list, but actually the first one that was on it was about the brand, the image that you see behind me, and the origins of Elysian Forge. So it's, I feel like it's kind of appropriate that on this, the last day of our crowdfunding campaign, there are just over 12 hours to go now. I think it's probably midnight Australian Eastern Standard Time is the last second of the campaign. It seems appropriate that now that we're near the end, we bring it full circle and talk about the beginnings of Elysian Forge and this whole thing. So the first thing, I guess, is the name Elysian Forge. So we considered a lot of different names. Many of them were like quite martial, like very warlike and kind of appropriate for the LARP combat, I think. But in the end, I think we intentionally stayed well away from something that was too kind of violent, I suppose, because in the end, we don't actually want the world to be full of more real violence. So we actually wanted to steer kind of well away from that. So Elysian is kind of a double meaning. One is it's very similar to my name. That is, I felt like it was maybe a little bit intellectually vain to name it after myself, but still, I think it's sort of okay with me in the end that it ended up being reflective of the fact that this wouldn't have come about without me. There was really only one brain that the idea of this whole thing came about in, and it was me. Not to belittle the role that my partner Anthony has played in this whole thing. Which is why I wanted to make sure that it was something that wasn't so linked to me that it couldn't exist without me. So there's always the chance that in the future sometime what we're doing now will evolve into something that's bigger. I certainly hope that it does. So for example, things like, well, we started in LARP and we're making these fantasy swords, these historical weapons, but in the future it certainly wouldn't be something that I'd object to. For it to become, you know, more of a general props company or perhaps special effects company or anything else really. If I've done things right, it will be just full of good people making good things. I don't think it needs, I intentionally wanted it to not necessarily be based exactly and only, you know, exclusively in LARP or in combat. So the name Elysian, the origins of that are in history. The place, the mythical place in Greek mythology called Elysium or the Elysian Fields, which were a place where it was kind of like the ancient Greek notion of the afterlife, really. It was kind of like the Greek version of Valhalla. It was the place, the final resting place of heroes that were chosen by the gods or related to the gods. So Elysian Forge is sort of supposed to suggest that, this otherworldly and heavenly paradise. And things created in the Forge were items or artifacts that were worthy of the gods chosen, worthy of those heroes. So that brings me around to quickly talking about my customers and business in general. And that is one thing that I wanted to say, which was when I was learning about business in high school, and one of the things that came up was that, you know, one of the benefits of owning your own business is that you get to be your own boss. And I think that's kind of one of the most important parts about it. I personally have not in the past had, for the most part, such good bosses that I feel like I've been in a place to fully respect authority. Except in a couple of cases, and in those cases there were people whom I admire greatly, and if this gets bigger and I end up in the position of a boss, it's those people whom I intend to emulate. But in general, being my own boss, I think gives me an amount of freedom without which I kind of suffer. But I guess one thing is that when you give up one boss or several bosses in some kind of like organization in favor of becoming business, what you find is that you're trading in that one or a few bosses for, you know, potentially thousands, and those bosses are my customers. But I think, to be honest, it even goes further than that. To be a little dramatic about it, it's the customers. They're not just bosses. You are not just bosses, not just parts of this system, this this business, arrangement, you are the ones who give me life, and it's funny that I have to interpret the views of the customers, because they don't necessarily always, you don't always necessarily know what you want. I certainly don't as a customer or other people. I don't always have the correct view of myself. So the job of what I want myself, so the job of the creator is to interpret things such that the customers will be happy, even though they don't necessarily tell you exactly what they want as is. So the funny thing is that as customers, you aren't necessarily my bosses. You give me life, you give me purpose, and I don't want to invite the wrath of my customers, because without that I won't have life. So in a weird way, you're not bosses, you're my gods, which brings me to my next point, which is that of religion and religious iconography. So I don't practice a religion, but I am no foe to religion in general. I grew up in a religion, and so I think I value it strongly for what it is good at. And I don't think that there's anything about it that suggests that a person is wrong or doing something bad. I want religion to be, well, I want this thing that we're doing to be inclusive of all kinds, for those people who are religious and those who aren't. But something that I specifically want is to keep symbols of religion out of my products. The reason being that the inclusion that I want to protect in this brand is one that, if I were to put a religious icon in there, it would be sort of excluding all others. So we are strongly based in history. It's something we're very proud of ourselves, is that our ability to bring historical elements into this. But because we're in a fantasy setting as well, or a setting that within LARP can be fantasy as well, it would be stifling to see actual religions portrayed in the weapons or artifacts that we make. They can't be interpreted in such a way that's sort of historical but still within an alternate culture. So we're specifically keeping things out, and that's partly also to avoid being disrespectful to certain religions. So for example, we have things like a strong Middle Eastern influence with curvy swords, and in many cases some elements that are somewhat, that invoke the art of the Middle East, in particular Islamic art. I personally find the geometric art to be incredibly beautiful. But I have spoken to some Muslim friends and figured out that specifically things like writing can be potentially misconstrued or can be disrespectful, so very intentionally we'll keep away from that. But that sort of brings me around to the origin of the symbol that you see here. This is the brand that I've chosen, and it is inspired by, I guess, Eastern cultures. Partly what I'm doing, partly the technology that I've created, this the curved cores, allow me to bring in, sort of almost to invite weapons from cultures that aren't similar to those in the West, which are somewhat, they're very well represented within LARP currently, with all the straight swords and the Western influence and the kind of Viking Age or middle, the medieval influences of the Western society. So this allows us to explore some cultures that are from sort of further east. So we wanted to come up with a symbol that was sort of pan-Eastern, so something that was representative of nearly anything sort of east of Germany, really. Like the only thing that a kind of flowing script like this, the only culture that wouldn't really work in is sort of one where, where writing is done in straight lines with runes and things that can be scratched into logs or chiseled into things. The script is supposed to be sort of flowing and suggestive of an Eastern influence, but no specific Eastern influence. So this is obviously a mix of the E, so Elysian, and an F for the Forge. So this F is also partly supposed to suggest the curve of a curved sword. So you can see this shamshu that I have is very similar. It's just supposed to have just enough overlap that it sort of suggests a nice graceful curve like that of the sword. And in fact, this was the very first one that we ever made, so I feel like that's somewhat appropriate. The combination of the two is sort of partly similar to what's called a tugra. I think that's Tughra if you want to look it up, which is kind of like a signature created by writing elements on top of one another, kind of like the J.R.R. Tolkien. They're kind of like superimposed on top of one another. And the tugra is, in fact, I think, absolutely beautiful. The scripts that the tugras, if you look for examples, I find them all to be completely beautiful. I personally only found out about them after creating this thing. That was something that Anthony, a co-founder, brought to my attention, but I found them absolutely beautiful. But the other thing that this is supposed to suggest, some of you will know already, is actually the Om from Buddhism, essentially, or not Buddhism, but Indo-Persian culture, and what's the word I'm looking for? Hinduism. So that culture spawned this symbol, which is Om. So it stands for the Om. And the Om is very hard to define exactly, but it is certainly a symbol and a meaning of peace and transcendence. And I think that's something that we really intentionally wanted to kind of invoke. It's the similarity of this Om. So you can see that it's kind of like, it's almost like a 3. And this is that's sort of supposed to mirror our E. And specifically this kind of diamond and crescent shape up here is the element that is supposed to most strongly reflect the Om, this symbol of peace, which that's something that we want to put out into the world more. Like I was saying, instead of the kind of martial, violent culture, we honestly, in the real world, here in the real world, we want to invoke a sense of peace and unity and togetherness. And I think the last element is that sometimes we put as a kind of border around this symbol, we put 2 crossed pentagons. That is supposed to suggest the kind of, I mentioned the geometric, like Islamic art. It's supposed to sort of suggest that without being directly pulled from it. And part of that is that the idea that beauty can sometimes come from maths, which, if you subscribe to the notion that maths is kind of the language of the universe, I personally think that is somewhere where those 2 concepts overlap really strongly. And the Middle East, in certain times in history, have absolutely led the charge on that. And it's most obvious from geometric art, so that's something that we wanted to put in there too. I think that's it. So thank you all. Thank you everybody who's come along with this journey with me. And I want to say that it's been absolutely wonderful meeting all of you. So hopefully you have a little bit of insight into me and the symbols that we choose to promote as part of this business. So thank you everybody for being involved in it.